This is your host of PoliTalks, Eric Hacopian, and we're very pleased to have with us, as our guest today, Tatevik Revazian, chair of the Civil Aviation Committee at the government at the Republic of Armenia, who's responsible for all aviation issues in the country. Mr. Revazian is a graduate of the Copenhagen Business School and has earned 2 master's degrees, one of them from the Stockholm School of Economics, and despite her young age, she has extensive background in the civil aviation area. It's a pleasure to have you on our program, Mr. Revazian.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Normally, we directly move into the issue of the topic of the day, but yours is quite a unique story. You're a Danish Armenian. There's not too many of them, and you're very young and female in an industry that's dominated by men. I suspect. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell you your personal story and how in such a young age you achieved such a significant position, and not only just achieving that position, but having significant experience in this field. So please explain.
I really never strived for it.
Okay.
I just realized at a young age what my passion is, and I made sure that I invested most of my time into my passion. Both in terms of my work, but also my personal life. So I dedicated myself to aviation from the age of 15, I would say. I remember clearly when I was in Copenhagen airport. I grew up right next to the airport, and I had this tradition with my friend to go there and watch all these employees work at the airport, feel the bustling atmosphere, dream about destinations we would go to together. And that led to me actually getting hired into Copenhagen airport at the age of 19. Again, one of the youngest employees there. I stayed there on and off for 4 years because it was while I was a student. So when I was going abroad to do my internships or to do my semester abroad, I would quit and then I would come back and get rehired. So it just became a part of me. Copenhagen airport became my second home. And I just continued. I just decided that this is the way to go. I basically, when I graduated, only applied for 2 jobs. One was at Copenhagen Airport afterwards, and the other was Momondo Group, which is now acquired by Kayak. It's a price comparison site for flights. Got hired there because they could feel the passion I have for the industry. So for them, it wasn't that important that I was a newly graduate. I came in, started negotiating all the airline contracts, and then as time passed, I got major contracts to sign and negotiate. So that was my road in. And then I continued into a Silicon Valley-based company called Flyer, building revenue management systems for airlines using machine learning technologies. And this was what brought me to Armenia and potentially led to this position that I'm in today. I convinced Flyer to open an engineering office here. So while I was doing my core work of negotiating with the airlines...
Is that a programming office when you say engineering office?
Yeah, exactly, programming office. So basically my core was to, again, negotiate with the airlines and lead that part of Flyer. But at the same time, I helped them establish the office here.
The Prime Minister always speaks of this, and this even goes to the previous regimes. Everyone has made a big priority of promoting tourism in this country. Obviously, we've had a change of government. What has this current government that you work for, what has it done to promote tourism, and what is its focus in growing the sector of the economy?
We collaborate very closely with the Tourism Committee because we're very much interconnected in terms of bringing more tourists to the country. I can say personally what I've done so far is basically trying to put Armenia on the map. Because when you go and you negotiate with the airlines, if they're not even aware of the potential that Armenia has, you firstly need to tell them about that potential. You need to do proactive work. Usually when route development is done, 90%...
What does that mean?
Route development is basically the process where airlines meet airports typically or meet governments to discuss new potential routes where the airlines see their next commercial value. And most of the time, like 90% of the routes are already pre-decided because they look at the numbers, they see clearly here's the commercial opportunity and they go there. However, Armenia is not in the 90%. Armenia is more into the 10%. And that's why it's important to do proactive work, because it's only the proactive countries that actually get into the more risky 10% that the airline would decide upon.
But going back to what are the specific things that you've done or you're doing to promote this sector outside of interesting airlines? When you say you're working with the tourism committee, what does the committee do, for example? A lot of people don't even know it exists. So what is their mandate, and what impact have they had, or have we had the tourism group that we've had because of natural growth?
Part of it is definitely natural growth, I would say. But part of it is also the work that the airport has done, the tourism committee has done. I wouldn't want to go too deeply into the tourism committee work, because it's not really my responsibility. Yeah, and I might say things a bit wrongly. But in general, I can say the way we collaborate. So the way it works is, for example, I went to India not long ago, a few weeks ago, and negotiated with the Indian Airlines. And the first thing I did when coming back was meeting with the newly elected chair for tourism committee, just to give her the feedback of what was discussed, where is the business opportunity, and should we focus on India or should we not? Because we need to work in the same direction. Considering that we have limited resources, we cannot target everything. We need to be collaborate.
I have read there's a rule of thumb that every 100 tourists creates one job. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I've read this countless times. Has anyone, or have you or your department quantified the actual impact of tourism growth and tourism on the economy? I've seen things that somewhere between 7 to 10 or 15% of jobs in the country are related to it. In the West, generally, tourism creates low-paying jobs, a lot of low-paying jobs. In Armenia, it's the opposite. It ends up creating higher-end jobs. Has anyone quantified what that means? Because every year you see reports that there's 10, 15% more visitors, even though some of that is hard to grasp, because someone going to Russia and coming back from work is not really a tourist in the traditional sense, or in any sense. So have you done, how would you explain what's the impact of the tourism sector on the economy?
Let me start off by saying the Civil Aviation Committee actually doesn't have a department or staff to do such studies. However, I find it extremely important, and it is something that we have done by trying to mobilize the resources that we have in the country, not necessarily only inside Civil Aviation Committee. An example, I went and negotiated with Ryanair, which led to them sending a proposal. And in order to be able to evaluate the proposal and give a comeback that's significantly better for Armenia, it's very important to do these studies. I think in Armenia we've had a tendency only to focus on cash cows. What is the money we get right now, today? And I want to move away from that type of mentality, because you can invest a certain amount of money or accept decreasing the costs of an airline, and then the airline will bring you hundreds and thousands of passengers who will come and spend money in the country and create jobs, as you mentioned. So we have done the study in order to evaluate Ryanair's proposal, and it's been very, very interesting results, and it's very helpful in negotiating a better deal with Ryanair.
Have you anything you can share from it, or is that not? Is that
it's still in process, but what I can say is I can give you the core idea of what we're looking into. We're looking into how we can decrease costs for airlines who are willing to take upon more risk, and a new route is risky for an airline, because it takes at least a couple of years before it actually becomes profitable for an airline to operate a new route. So we want to encourage point-to-point traffic, and those airlines who would be willing to do that, we're trying to give them incentives in terms of lower costs. However, we're in the process of both discussing this with the government, with the airport and the airlines. So basically, I'm in the middle of everything, trying to make everyone satisfied.
For our American viewers, because a lot of people in Europe, everybody knows Ryanair, but for our American viewers, Ryanair is the number one airline in Europe.
Yep,
And it's
the largest
budget airline. So
and the fastest growing.
Yeah, it's exceptionally important, and it's a huge. If you can actually manage to get them here, it'll be a huge development. I have told countless people that I'm going to be interviewing you, and I have a series of what I call layman's questions, which is everyone's questions that people have been itching to ask because no one's ever answered it. So I'm going to give you a chance to do that.
All right.
One is, why do we have such horrible arrival and departure hours? Two, why are the prices so high comparatively? And three, given the high level of traffic we have from the west coast of the United States, we don't have direct flights from California or Los Angeles to Yerevan, when many of these people who fly from Los Angeles fly over Armenia to get to Doha and then get a flight back. So I want to give you a chance to explain to ordinary people.
Let's start with the letter. There's a misunderstanding in terms of the amount of passengers we actually have from Los Angeles. I mean, there's a high amount of passengers, of course, especially considering the fact that Los Angeles is so far away. It's not the most obvious destination just from an aviation point of view, but from a diaspora point of view it is. However, at this stage, we wouldn't be able to fill the aircraft. It's not commercially viable for airlines to conduct that route.
Even in the summer?
Even in the summer. Maximum a charter flight or so, but not a scheduled regular flight. I mean, it's not viable for an airline to start flying a route once a week, because it doesn't give the passenger the flexibility the passenger needs to fly whenever they want, to fly at the price rate that's acceptable as well. Very often direct flights are actually more expensive than when you do a transit.
Because you go to a hub. It's the reason they have hubs.
Exactly. I think the only way I see the solution right now in terms of having a direct flight in the future is try to make Armenia a transit hub. So the traffic is not only based on Armenians or Americans wanting to visit Armenia, but it could also be, let's say, Indians coming to Armenia and continuing their flights by Armenia.
Now, let's go into the arrival times and the departure hours. Explain that.
Yeah. It's actually for the sake of the passenger, because in reality it's because of our geographical location that flights are conducted at night, because very often we fly somewhere to continue our flight somewhere else, and we need to make it to our next flight. So most flights to other European destinations and to the US depart early in the morning in Europe. So if we reach too late, then we might lose a whole day at the transit point.
So it's just a matter of practicality, and it's not going to change.
It's going to change if we can encourage more point-to-point traffic. Right now, our market is very much based on transfer passengers. If we can decrease the costs for airlines flying point-to-point, yes, that is the solution.
And on the price, on the ticket price being higher here than in other places, first of all, is that accurate? And if so, why?
Well, it depends on what we compare to, right? I compare it to Denmark because that's where I grew up and that's the pricing that I've been used to. And yes, compared to Denmark and a lot of European destinations, we are very expensive. I think the main issue is lack of competition. I mean, if airlines can charge a high amount of money and still get their tickets sold, they will do that. They're a business. So what we need to make sure both our airport management, but also the government, is to attract more airlines in order for them to compete and not have the option of selling the tickets at a higher rate.
Going back to the Ryanair issue, there's obviously an issue of Armenia, I think on paper has a national airline, but in reality it's a question. I mean, we've had it, we've lost it, we've had it. We had 3 of them, even though none of them were flying. It's this absurd situation. First of all,
currently we don't have a national airline.
First of all, how important is it to have a national airline? Because there are always, there could be, you have a war, you have things in which, a national airline can be quite helpful. How important is it to have a national airline? Why don't we have one? And as far as the budget carriers, if we actually get a significant budget airline to fly into the country, what does that mean? What does that do to the aviation market, and what kind of tourists are you bringing here with that?
Let's start in terms of the security issue.
Yeah.
In terms of security issue, it's important to own the aircraft. You can own the aircraft by being a local airline. You can own the aircraft by being a national airline. You don't have to be a flag carrier to actually own an aircraft. And most often there's this misunderstanding that we will be safe if we have a national airline, but that is not true, because a national airline also look into costs, and buying an aircraft is extremely expensive. And the cheapest option, which most managers choose, is to lease the aircraft. If you lease the aircraft in the condition of war, the leasing company will take that aircraft back. So I wouldn't put our security into that. I would definitely go another way, and I hope we have people having those considerations for our country. In terms of just to differentiate what is a national airline and what is a local airline, I think a lot of people misunderstand. A national airline means giving specific benefits to that airline. Going into the competition level and having an impact, trying to save them when things go wrong, trying to give them better conditions so their costs are lower than their competitors. What I've seen when I look at the global industry today is that it doesn't work well. It really doesn't. A lot of governments are right now struggling, not understanding what should they do about their national airline, because they're obliged to protect them. At the same time, they cost the government so much money. But the benefits they often bring are not significant. And I don't think that Armenia is at a stage where we can just put money into a company that might or might not survive for security issues that are not even solved by going this direction. What I want is to have a local airline, a locally registered airline, which will be able to serve our market, which will be able to bring growth to Armenia, which will be able to hire pilots, engineers, because that's what will happen if we actually have airlines who would put a base in the country. And I want that airline to compete on even grounds, because if we learn to compete on even grounds, we can actually come up with solutions to the world market. Armenia is too small of a market to have its own airline, but if we look at the region is actually quite underserved. So there is some potential.
You've mentioned the concept of a hub. One, why is that relevant? And two, how would you make a small market into a hub? And then what regions would it serve? A hub is a question whether a hub or a base. We would start up with a base, with a small amount of aircrafts that are actually parked in Armenia, because then it would be the Armenian crew that would fly those aircrafts. So that's the direction we go. Hub is a more long-term idea. We need to take the first step first and prove that we can do that by providing good enough conditions for airlines to be interested. At this stage, we're not there at all. We need to make some changes, both in terms of the pricing structure of the airport, but also the pricing structure or the cost structure of the government in terms of taxation and so on. One of the things you told me in our prior conversations is that one of the things that you do when you travel around the world is you present investment opportunities for people to invest in. Well, that seems to be a rather high bar. I mean, because obviously anything in this industry will take multiple millions. What do you mean by investment opportunities in this sector?
Well, we've prepared business cases. So, for example, when we went to Ryanair, we specifically looked into what are Ryanair's strategic goals and how can we as a country contribute to those goals. Because very often when we present ourselves, we have an inside view. What do we need? But in reality, in negotiation processes, you need to understand what they need exactly, and how can you actually contribute to that. And then we prepared the business cases based on that, and we had quite good success with it. I mean, with specific numbers, we show the potential of the market. And actually, as a result, after our negotiations with Ryanair, Kappa, which is a very famous analytics company in aviation, basically all decision makers read their analysis. Without our request, did an analysis in Armenia and the potential entrance of a company like Ryanair, a low-cost airline. And they basically showed the same as we did, that the market, and not only our market, but the region is actually very much underserved by low-cost airlines. So there's much to do. And airlines, low-cost airlines, have ordered so many aircraft, more than 200, and they are actively searching for new places to grow.
Well, I'm going to finish up with a question that I like to ask. We have a reformist government, a progressive government, and in our cabinet we only have one woman, and there's very few people like you in positions of power. And I've made a rule of bringing that up whenever I have the chance. So explain to me if that's acceptable, and what should we do to change that?
It's not acceptable. I think we need more role models. I think those who are actually in the government and female have a responsibility of trying to attract more females to come. Because very often in hiring processes, people tend to hire people that are like them. And when there are a lot of men, it's obvious that it's easier for men to enter those positions. So what I'm personally trying to do is, whenever there are events where I can inspire young women to take this responsibility, to not be scared, to become risk takers and so on, I never reject, besides if I'm not in the country or have something else that I've committed myself to. But this is highly important to do, because the problem is two ways. It's both that men might not trust women in these positions, and I've felt this myself in a very male-dominated world. There are things that men do that they would definitely not do if there was a male in this position. But there's also a problem with females not always having the confidence to actually agree on taking up the position. I can use myself as an example. I usually present myself as this fearless person who just goes and reaches goals and so on. But when I was offered this position, I did everything I could not to get it. If there wasn't a person next to me sitting and actually convincing me, actually reminding me that this is so aligned with my vision for our country, for my vision for myself as well, I would probably not have been sitting here. I've definitely not fought to get this position.
Well, do me a favor, thank that person who convinced you. It's been a pleasure having you, and it was a great conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, too.